Agent Albatross here again with the Cypher Unlimited crew. We have our usual suspects of AD or Alpha Dean. We have Spigs18 or Anthony. And Dean, what are we doing here today?
Well, today, like any other day, we're here to talk about Cypher System, but we're talking about running fantasy games in Cypher System, and there's lots of different genres and so on and so forth. So we're just going to kind of talk about that and, try to give some examples and, make a nice discussion here tonight. We're going to just toss it over here to Anthony and let him, go ahead and introduce how we're going to approach the talk tonight.
Yep, I think for the this discussion, we're probably gonna break it down into three different genres of fantasy and try to give you some tips and ways of visualizing each one of these genres of fantasy, and hopefully it will help you build a better fantasy setting if you want to run it in Cypher System. So, for like I said, for the sake of this discussion, we broke it down into three major fantasy genres. And yes, I know there's hundreds of different types of subgenres, but just we didn't have all day, so we broke it down into three major categories. The three categories we broke it down into is traditional fantasy, which includes high and low magic settings, modern and contemporary fantasy, and last but not least, science fantasy genres. So I'll let Al start it off, and he'll give us the definition of traditional fantasy.
So we're gonna start with traditional fantasy. We got this definition off of Wikipedia, and it just makes sense for us to start there for a discussion. So the fantasy genre is of speculative fiction set in a fictional universe, often inspired by real-world myth or folklore. Its roots are in oral traditions, which then become fantasy literature and drama. In popular culture, the fantasy genre predominantly features settings of a medieval nature. Most fantasy uses magic or other supernatural elements as a plot element, theme, or setting. Magic and magical creatures are common in many of these worlds. So, some examples of traditional fantasy are things like Forgotten Realms, Game of Thrones, Dragonlance, The Princess Bride, How to Train Your Dragon, the Shannara series, sorry, I butchered
Shannara.
that, Conan, Legend, Neverending Story, and Dark Crystal. There's a bunch more, but those are just a couple of quick examples. So let's start this off real fast and let's break it down even further. What is the difference between high and low fantasy? I'll let one of y'all take it away from here.
Go ahead,
Uh,
Ed.
to me, high and low level fantasy is the amount of magic in the world, how prevalent magic is in the setting. A perfect example would be something like Forgotten Realms, where even the most common peasant has access to magic, healing potions, and stuff like that. And a low magic setting is, magic is rare or it comes with a cost. So it's more traditional, you know, uh, if you playing a low fantasy setting, your characters might not have as much access to magic items. They more traditional, like fantasy fighter type characters with the rare occasional magic user. And even if you have a magic user in the party, he doesn't have access to the extraordinary spells that you would get in a high magic setting, like something like Forgotten Realms, say, from D&D.
And yeah, basically, I said it's like sword and sandals as opposed to swords and sorcery. You know, like Anthony said, that's my favorite thing about what I would say a low fantasy game would be um, the cost. It's gritty. It's dark. Um, things are much more final. You know, death is a real thing. Injury is a real thing. Because you can't just go get healed up, and it's normally about the intestinal fortitudes of the characters as opposed to what grand magic item or what grand ability they might have. Conan is probably one of the best examples of that. Conan is gritty, rough, dark. When there is any magic in the world, it's ritualistic, it's demonic, it's things that the common man wouldn't normally have to face, so to speak.
from a games standpoint, from a game mastering standpoint, and developing, if you want to develop a low magic setting, like what are some of the things you think you would do in the design process of your setting? Like what would be some of the thought process, going into, hey, I want to do this low magic setting opposed to this high magic setting in Cypher, like.
Well, probably one of the biggest things I would do is when I got my hands on the adapt, it would have to be adapted, with a different set of thoughts in place. They would become more the scientists, alchemists. What they would do, would be, you know, akin to, like I said, working in a laboratory. These would be the guys who would, just like if I wanted to reskin Onslaught for a low fantasy game, I would probably say, okay, this guy makes, you know, Molotov cocktails, where, and that's how he would, do it. But he would know the science behind it, and he would have, it would be some special mixture that he would make. So anybody else throwing it, it just would break and be, chemicals on the ground. But because of something he does, it explodes.
That's a great interpretation. I think I would probably limit the amount of foci that I would allow.
That
You
too.
know, I think I would cut down on the list dramatically. A lot of those super powery looking sounding foci might not be right for this particular fantasy setting. So you might have to, like really like go through the foci list, and with a comb, and brush off everything that you don't think is going to fit into your setting. And that's okay, because at the end of the day, you're trying to find a mood and feel, and mood is very important in a low fantasy setting. It's like what you said, everything comes with a cost. So you don't want to make it easy for your players, so you would have to eliminate those foci that would make it too easy for them.
And
Exactly.
and in that same train of thought, you would also have to take a look at how you're incorporating ciphers into that low fantasy setting, because most ciphers have these outrageous effects that you really wouldn't find in a low fantasy setting. So you can tweak it a couple of ways. You can either restrict what kind of ciphers you put into that game, or you can focus heavily on subtle ciphers. Those are usually very again subtle, obviously, and they don't really have these grand effects. It's more usually assets to something or another, and it's still a way to incorporate that gameplay mechanic within your low fantasy setting, because not having ciphers in the Cypher system seems a little counterintuitive. or
And I think
whatever.
I think we mentioned this before, but you could always use the asset deck in lieu of the subtle
Right.
cipher deck as well. I mean, it works. It's going to work later on in a couple of the other settings we're going to talk about. But I think you could definitely use the asset deck in lieu of a cipher deck in the low fantasy.
Oh, absolutely. And the other thing too is, create. I would probably create a list of ciphers that existed if I wanted to have some manifest ciphers.
Mhm.
Those would probably become a little bit more rare, probably more just bordering on the artifact side of things. They not necessarily, so they would be around, but not that common. It was like finding a cachet of something or something along those lines.
And on top of that, again, Cypher System gives you the tools to really play with like how you want things to run. So let's say in your low fantasy setting that you like perhaps want them to find a high powered cipher that does a very strong magical ability, you can toss on a negative effect on there as well. Maybe they can shoot a fireball, but they lose 5 int for doing it. Something
Right.
like that.
But like we
Oh,
said, magic at a cost.
yeah, Dean made me think of something like that makes a ton of sense. It's low magic, but magic isn't non-existent. So you still have to have some, you could still have a small list of powerful ciphers. It's just they wouldn't get it as often. Or maybe, they would get one person in the party would have the cipher, and when it's used, then as a GM, you could give a different player, a powerful
Right.
cipher. You just can't have them all running around with powerful ciphers. And yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Pete.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I mean, we said low fantasy. Now let's talk about high fantasy.
So I mean, high fantasy is actually, I mean, I don't want to say easy to run a Cypher system. There are a couple of hurdles you face when trying to run high fantasy in Cypher, but for the most part, at its base, it's pretty good. Like a lot of the focus makes sense in a fantasy setting. You can reskin them to work as such. Ciphers as well. A lot of the stuff just clicks within a fantasy setting, a high fantasy setting, because when you're doing high fantasy, there's really no boundaries, if that makes sense. Like the sky's the limit as far as your magic is concerned, so you can just reflavor things as you like to fit maybe the overarching story you're trying to tell, or maybe the specifics of the setting. But basically, like, all the focus work, all the types work. Like, it's not really too restrictive in that regard as far as Cypher System goes.
Now, and I'm only saying this because it does exist as well. Now, not to contradict Al. But in a high fantasy setting, you can also do set certain types of restrictions. Sometimes those end up being fun. You know, like if I were, just for example, if I was trying to adapt the Robert Jordan books, the Wheel of Time series, there's the Aes Sedai and the I always forget the male aspect, but the Aes Sedai, they're the magic users in the world, and there's a male and female aspect to magic, and there's a cost, to using it, and there's two rules of thought, like the women have to submit to the magic, where the men have to struggle with it. But males using magic in this game also, or in this world also, has it slowly drives them mad. So it's like all sorts of different ways to do it, but the magic is there. It's fireball throwing and you know lances made out of the air and all sorts of craziness. So
I was gonna say another tip I would think for high fantasy that you wouldn't traditionally do with a lot of other settings is you could actually take abilities from type flavor types focus and turn them into magic items, turn them into ciphers, turn them into artifacts. It's with a high fantasy you have more leeway when you're crafting your elements for your narrative than you would traditionally with other settings. And I think a lot of the mindset of a lot of people would tend to not try that, but this is the type of setting that you definitely should try it because it's going to make your setting more unique and it's going to make your games more interesting.
and I just want to add to that too, for everybody out there, when you're building, whether it's a high fantasy or a low fantasy setting, but a traditional fantasy world, you know what? Break the mold. It's your world. Don't don't feel like you're constrained by the concepts of, European folklore, or you know, or Japanese anime, or whatever it might be that's inspiring you. Break the mold, have fun with it, and build. That's I think that's the best part about a traditional fantasy setting, because it isn't the real world. It's only based on it.
Now that you spoke about breaking the mold, let's what MCG books you think you could use to create a traditional fantasy world, whether it's high or low. What books you think is helpful for someone that wants to say, hey, look, I'm gonna start this setting. Let me pull out some books that give me, spark some ideas, or I might need them for my creatures and such.
I think,
Or
well, a no-brainer, from Worlds of the Cypher System. Look at Gods of the Fallen. Gods of the
I
Fallen,
mean,
excellent book.
first off, Al, we said we were gonna say a disclaimer.
Oh yeah,
The
yeah.
the
So
the, the
the disclaimer here is just that we're not gonna mention the Cypher core books because it just goes without saying that they're
it,
awesome inspiration for basically anything that you're trying to run. So
yeah,
we're
the
trying.
cipher. Okay.
Yeah, we're just trying to touch on maybe some side books, or setting books that you may not know of or you may not own or whatever have you, but still have great content within them for these
And
settings.
yeah,
Not cipher core books, but the cipher core book itself.
Yeah,
Right.
no, but when I said books, I meant like the original and the revised.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And
The Cypher Core books is gonna go without saying because you're gonna need that for every single one of these genres.
so, and the reason I'm saying, and just let me clarify real quick then, because that's a good thing. Thanks for saying that, Al, and Anthony for remembering. Um, the Gods of the Fall can literally be used to do both high and low fantasy. You just have to, you just got to look at it and kind of, understand, take certain aspects and build that fantasy world. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
Um, I have a couple. Al, you wanna mention a book or?
No, I mean, what I like looking at for like the for setting up fantasy stuff is what's that book? Expanded Worlds. Like that has a lot of interesting things in it that you can use for low and high fantasy. I can't think of any specific foci off the top of my head at the moment that come from that book. But there's a lot of different
Sails
things.
under the Jolly Roger.
Yeah, oh, that's a really fun one that's in there. Yeah, yeah. But there's a ton in that book that can be drawn from for these, like, especially for low fantasy where there's not much magic in place. There's a lot of, I don't want to say mundane foci, but like foci that don't rely on a magic or, extremely high tech source, if that makes sense. So I really like that book.
I have two that I think would definitely be helpful for you in high and low fantasy. One is The Strange. The Strange has a whole world book and multiple, recursions that are fantasy based. And the Strange Bestiary especially is perfect to pull baddies from because a lot of those creatures can be reskinned to traditional folklore, um what you call it, creatures that you would find in traditional folklore, and you can reskin them and it stats them out for you perfectly. And the last one I would have mentioned isn't necessarily a Monte Cook Games produced product, but Mortal Fantasy by Ganza Gaming, is a excellent resource for low or high fantasy, specifically high fantasy, because not only does he stat out most of the races for you, he gives you most of the traditional Dungeons and Dragons style tropes and classes in there. So I would definitely recommend if you were running a low high fantasy game, and me and Dean are going to talk about this at the end of this discussion, which we both are, and we both utilizing that book. So I would definitely throw out Ganza Gaming's Mortal Fantasy.
Excellent book.
For
Absolutely.
sure. But now that we've touched on all this stuff, I did mention earlier there are some hurdles when it comes to running, specifically high fantasy, Cypher System games. And let's touch on that for a moment. There is one major complaint that I hear a lot from people who are trying to run high fantasy, and it's specifically the limitations of the magic users. They don't have access to many spells. You have a pretty limited scope on what you can do as far as your adept and your focus. Like, you can still do amazing stuff as per your focus, but in most high fantasy genres or settings, a mage has like a list of things they can choose from to do, and that's just not really present in Cypher System.
And my only argument to that is maybe it's because of the way I look at it. I actually appreciate that a lot because what it does is give you the opportunity as both the player and the game master to set the parameters of the magic in your world. They give you lots of great seeds as far as I'm concerned. I look at it, in that respect. But Anthony?
Yeah, I'm gonna touch on it in 2 points. I think what Dean says is absolutely right. I think what the problem is not the fact that you can't run an effective magic user, but you can't. I think most people's opinion is you can't run a Vancian style magic user, which there's a big difference. And just because a magic user doesn't use Vancian magic doesn't mean it can't be effective. And I think a lot of times that the person that wants to play a magic user in Cypher System wants the feel of a Vancian magic user. But hold on, I'm just gonna say, but the other point I want to get is that magic isn't a problem as a setting, because I think magic narratively you could pretty much give anything magic in Cypher System. So I think it's a problem for a player that wants to capture that Vancian magic feel.
But real quick,
But
Anthony, so I don't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
For our viewers at home and for myself as well, what is a Vancian magic user?
A Vancian magic user is the traditional D&D magic user. That means you have a spell book, you memorize spells, you prepare a certain amount of spells a day, and it comes from a old series of books by Jack Vance. Am I wrong? Am I
Right.
correct?
Jack
Where
the Hollow Earth, or
yeah, the Hollow Earth
or
series.
the Earth Dawn, something like that, Dying Earth.
Yeah, but it was an author called Jack Vance, and he came up with this style that you memorize spells from a spell book, and you have and every day you could change the spells you memorize. So it gave and D&D adapted that, at the very beginning of D&D, and they kept that magic system throughout its entire existence. So
Okay,
most people grew. Hold on a second. Most people grew up with that style of magic as what they believe is what a wizard should be.
So in Jack Vance's books were called The Dying Earth. That's what they were.
Gotcha.
Published from 1950 to 84. But and that's the biggest thing with me. Personally, been gaming for so long, and I get it, but I've even seen how those things can be done in Cypher System. You just have it's a thought process, and I think that's the biggest thing is the thought process, is the approach that we take when we sit down at the table to play Cypher, and when we start building worlds and everything else. And I think if you have that discussion with your players, you can kind of break the mold, and you can get, and I'm not saying you're going to get the Vancian feel, but you're going to get that magic user feel, that powerful mage feel, just by building it in your own way. Because I've read other books that had some interesting and awesome magic systems, ideas. Piers Anthony wrote the Juxtaposition series, and in that series, no spell could be cast the same again. Once it was cast one time, it was done. So you could make variations on it, but every magic user built their spells. So it was like pretty awesome,
I absolutely agree with you. I think that Cypher System can do magic users. And I wasn't saying, I was just giving the point of what a lot of traditional people feel, and that's their gripe. I think that Cypher handles magic users well. It just doesn't handle that specific type of magic user well.
And all I was saying was I just wanted to try to give people a way out, or a way around it. To if my favorite line, my paradigm shift. If we Cypher System is the big baby of the paradigm shift. I mean, that's literally what you have to do. And once you break that mold, that traditional school of thought that we've all come from, you find the beauty, the elegance, and the possibilities.
But that's not to say that, let's say you like to homebrew stuff. There are many ways you can homebrew a Vancian type magic user within Cypher System. It just requires a little more work. It's not spelled out for you within the raw, but there's so many different ways to handle it that, maybe if you have an idea, you can come to Cypher Unlimited, talk about it with people, try to brainstorm. Like, we've had people talk about their various magic ideas or magic system ideas.
I mean, no, you're right, because me and Anthony have already talked about it.
We're actually working on it now.
Literally just waiting for Tallest and Godforsaken to drop, so we can kind of get a feel for what direction we need to go.
This is the video for this, but I think it's not even necessarily. I think it's the issue comes in a design perspective. I think in Cypher System, abilities and magic kind of are interwoven into each other.
Yes,
so it's more descriptive as a player, and in Vancian magic is spells are specific. You know what I mean? So it gives you the impression that you have more variety, because the sheer number of spells you have do specific things. And Cypher System, the abilities and what quote unquote will be a spell could be utilized multiple ways, which Vancian magic is like, like Dean could name a Cypher System spell that could be flavored as 6 different, D&D spells,
Yep.
where the mindset changes. So, I mean, I agree with you that you can flavor the advanced magic thing. I just think that the way both the systems are designed, it isn't necessarily, even if you did do that, you won't necessarily still capture that feel.
Well,
And some people some people just want the feel, not necessarily what the mechanical benefits are.
Yeah.
right. And I think in that respect, if we take just like a final point that I want to make, Anthony said a mouthful when he said that we could name abilities within Cypher System that would mimic other spells from the Vancian, from Vancian magic, and that's the whole key. Prime example is onslaught. Onslaught
Could
is
be
an
like
ability.
6 or 7 different.
Actually, it could be anything you want. I mean, literally, it could be magic missile. It could be um, frost. Or what is it? Cone of cold.
Eldritch
It could
Blast.
be,
Yeah,
it could be
Eldritch Blast.
it could be Eldritch Blast. It definitely could be Eldritch Blast. And the thing about it is, because again, it's what Monty did, Monte Cook Games, the crew did. They took those traditional ideas and just put them down on a baseline. But even like certain abilities, certain foci you pick up. If you picked up, what is it? Uh,
Dean, let's move on because this is going to become a let's do magic
okay,
discussion.
It definitely makes sense.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but
yeah, because the brain gets it going. It's okay.
That's usually what happens. We start talking about something nice, and
not for nothing, I know me and Dina actually we have discussions every night because we both currently working on traditional fantasy settings that we're running on the server. We both hard at work trying to capture the first edition feel of D&D in Cypher System. So we've had these discussions. We've had multiple note sessions, hours of discussions. So I know exactly where he's coming from. But let's talk about ciphers and artifacts. How do we make ciphers and artifacts impactful in a traditional fantasy setting?
I mean, oh.
Go ahead, Al.
No, I mean, it depends. If you're doing low fantasy, we already kind of touched on that. You want to go with like mostly subtle ciphers, or ciphers are very like with the powerful effects are very rare, or something like that, or come with a homebrew added cost or something like that. But as far as high fantasy goes, it's like the foci. The sky's the limit. You can basically take anything from like the cipher book or like a deck or something, and reflavor it into a fantasy setting where there'd be like a spell scroll or a potion, or there's so many little things in high fantasy settings that could, you just reflavor the ability into, like I said, like a potion, a scroll, an inscription you read off of, stone tablet, like.
I mean, that's how I was. Actually, I probably misphrased the way the question was, but how do you incorporate it? And that's a perfect example.
I incorporated it. I adapted Dark Sun with another guy that was on our server, and we incorporated ciphers by using the Wild Magic Surge. That was a thing in Dark Sun. And that's how characters ended up with these odd abilities, but they were like quick one use, and Wild Magic Surges. I mean, there's so many ways that you can incorporate, and as far as artifacts are concerned, artifacts are those
magic weapons, items.
Those permanent magic items that you get, the medallion, the cloak,
Also, go ahead, Al.
No,
I was just gonna say though, but there is one conceit with Cypher System. Most artifacts have some sort of depletion roll, so that's a different kind of mechanic. But I don't see it being hard to incorporate.
I think that's actually good.
Oh, absolutely.
One, if they do deplete it, then you could come up with new cool magic items to get.
Exactly.
Right.
Or you
and
can
it also explains away the Pathfinder problem where people, want to gear up, like get rid of the +2 swords because they got the +3 swords. Well, now you could explain it in the narrative that they wear away. They, magic items don't last forever.
Or like in some cases, you're no longer worthy. It's gone from you. Or it needs to recharge. You can do that kind of deal with the depletion roll. So all sorts of ways to get around it.
Before I ask my next question, I just want to say it was Steven that helped out with the Dark Sun, right?
Yes.
I want to give credit where credit is due.
Exactly. Steven Siebert.
Yep. The last thing I was going to say is, you guys sort of touched on it, but how do you explain the cipher limit in a fantasy setting? That's something that isn't traditional to non-Cypher System fantasy games. So can you guys give me some ways to explain cipher limits in a fantasy setting?
I think it's explained pretty well in the book. I don't think it's this verbatim, but
Which book are you talking about?
The Cypher core book. I think that it's referenced in the fantasy section, maybe in the original book. I forget exactly where I read it, but it's or maybe it's just from the science fiction setting. But either way, it states that something along the lines: if you hold too many ciphers, they are too powerful. They have the chance to blow up. Maybe it's from Numenera. I don't know. So in a fantasy setting, you can just say if you're holding...
Yeah, that sounds like Numenera.
Yeah, if you're holding too many, the power, you become a nexus for not a nexus, but a concentration point for magical energy, and either the things could misfire, or maybe you become an attraction for people who are hunting magical things. Like those could become GMIs later down the road.
Well, that's the Gods of the Fall.
Oh, that actually is a GMI, Gods of the Fall?
Well, it's not a GMI. That's literally how they explain the cipher limit.
Maybe that's where I read it.
If you're carrying too many ciphers, you actually attract otherworldly creatures who want to consume the magic.
There's so many different ways to go about it in a fantasy setting. There's a lot of ways to explain how funky magic might be, or they might interact weird with each other if you hold too many, or or you might be hunted for them.
And one way that I would do it, a cipher limit, I would just say attunement. These items you have to attune yourself to, and you can only attune yourself to a certain number.
That's a great solution. Or you could also go the other route and say there is no cipher limit.
That's actually what I do, honestly.
Yeah. And as the GM, you can still control the general amount of ciphers people have. If you notice that they hoarding their ciphers, just don't make them as prevalent.
Exactly. That's exactly what I do in my home game. My home game is a high fantasy, high traditional fantasy. And yeah, I really don't focus on the cipher limit because one, they're pretty much using them all the time, and two, if I find them hoarding it, I do what Anthony says. I just don't make them find any.
Where are you pulling most of your ciphers from?
I make them up.
Okay.
On the spot. I don't even make this just goes to show you how I GM. I don't make a list. Having a deck would be ideal. I have many decks, but the way I play, I generally flavor them based on what's happening in the setting, in the situation at hand. So if they're in a dungeon, they might find something off a dead body a previous adventurer had, and I just come up on the spot. Maybe they had a potion or whatever. I think of that stuff on the spot and make up mechanics on the spot for the ciphers as well.
Yeah. And for someone that doesn't normally have the wherewithal to come up with stuff immediately, you can always there's a lot of books that provide you with ciphers, and you could, especially for high fantasy, you could pretty much use anything in the cipher core book. You could pretty much use half of the stuff in the Strange, half of the everything in Gods of the Fall, half of the stuff in Numenera, and just reflavor them to a fantasy setting. So it's real easy to get ciphers.
And on top of that, I mentioned it just now, but the decks, the what is it? The cipher decks, the asset decks, the artifact decks, all those things you can pull from them and just reskin them to be fantasy oriented. And that's that's even better than the books. You just have it on hand, you flip through one, you need one at random, bing bang boom, there it is. And even if you don't want to do it randomly, you can look through a deck before your session and gather all the fantasy-ish you feel, or the ones you feel are fantasy-ish, and set those aside to be randomly pulled from later.
Yep.
Yeah, I would definitely say that that's probably the best route to go with in a fantasy setting, is because normally on a modern game, and you know that I run a game on a napkin, but with fantasy, I think that you run the risk of repetitiveness if you come up with every cipher on the fly. So with a fantasy setting, especially a high fantasy setting, you want sort of specialty with your ciphers. So like something that makes them different from others. Like you don't want to constantly lean on the healing potion, the giant grow. So I would recommend that you put yourself a list of 20 ciphers on the side that you pre-read and pre-approved, as fantasy ciphers.
And just to play devil's advocate, it's not wrong if you decide that's what you want to do either.
I mean, that's what I said at the beginning. I said,
Oh, I didn't hear you, Ted. I'm
I
sorry.
said personally.
Yeah, no. I'm just saying it's not wrong if you want to
Yeah,
have, the traditional ones.
yeah.
I'm of the same school with you. You know that. I love creating stuff. I like unique, or different, however you want to, put it. So yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean that you couldn't create 20 unique ciphers. I just said that
It's
you,
less work.
yeah, you no, I just said that with fantasy in particular, as opposed, I never write cipher lists if I'm running a modern game or a supers game. But in fantasy in particular, you run the risk of repetitive cipher thoughts. It's just like, you go to the, like, I can't, me personally, I can't go to the well as often with originality in fantasy that I can with a modern setting.
No, that completely makes sense. In that regard, you're just talking about people like I find myself doing it in my high fantasy home game too, where I fall back on the tropes like, hey, you found a
Yeah,
healing potion, hey, you found what is it, a scroll of invisibility,
yeah, yeah,
like you end up again. It's not a horrible thing, but players might get tired of it.
yeah,
Well,
I
yeah.
haven't heard any
No,
complaints myself, but yeah,
well, you know what?
I mean, I always look at it from a GM's lens. I'm sorry if I like.
yeah.
Yeah, because as a player, I don't think too many players are going to complain if you're giving them a way to heal. It's not a big deal. You know.
I mean, but that leads us into our last question for traditional fantasy is, and we kind of touched on a lot of this, especially when we were talking about Magic. But what does Cypher does well, and what needs adjustments when you're running a traditional fantasy game?
Uh, I think Cypher does just about all of it well, and the only thing that needs adjustment to me is the mindset of the people at the table. Everybody as a collective.
I love Dean, but Dean never has anything negative to say.
That's not true. I have negative things to say. But you know
Well,
what? I think I don't have any. Most of my negatives are not negatives for the simple fact I work them out internally.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying? So I see. I look at.
yeah.
I'm looking at this through the paradigm shifted eyes.
Yeah, but even in the paradise shifted eyes, there is nothing perfect. There's no perfect diamond, So I can't view stuff that way. I mean, I think the one thing I think Cypher does a lot of things well in fantasy, specifically warriors, combat. I think Cypher's a breath of fresh air when it comes to fantasy. It speeds up the time it takes to run a combat in Cypher, which is one of the problems with other fantasy games traditionally. You tend to bog down with combats.
Tell me
Like
about
it can literally, like a combat could run,
it. Tell me
two,
about
three
what.
hours in a session.
How long? How
But
long you
hold on,
said?
let me finish my thought. You had your chance, and you
Three
said that
hours?
you said everything was perfect.
I said it's fine.
And what it doesn't do well is I do think that Magic it, it needs a little more variety, like which can be accomplished, and we're working on that. But I think Monty's definitely going to work on that in Tolis and God's Forsaken. But there is some, and also another thing too, variety in creatures. If you're not a person that creates creatures on the fly, or the person that's able to reskin, you're not good at reskinning creatures. If you take all the books, you might have traditional fantasy creatures, maybe about 2025. Like me and Dean are currently rebuilding first edition D&D, and I literally had to recreate a ton of the traditional fantasy creatures from scratch. It would be helpful if they had some of those, just like traditional, fantasy creatures that you would see in most fantasy settings, not necessarily D&D specific.
Well, with Tullus and Godforsaken coming out, I'm
Yeah, it should
positive we'll
help
see
it.
a
Yeah.
spike in that number. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But I was just mentioning it because it is worth mentioning since we're doing it now that the majority of my work right now is actually creating a lot of traditional fantasy trope creatures that Cypher System currently doesn't have statted out.
Yeah, most definitely. And another thing really, and this falls to the GM, I guess. I don't think there's too strict of rules because I feel like in a fantasy setting, I haven't really done much of it. Actually, I have done a little bit of it in my games, but a lot of people like to see these like +1 like sword or like +2 armor or whatever have you. It's super easy to craft that stuff, like homebrew it, but I don't think there's anything specifically in the books about like how to go about making that a thing in your fantasy games. And that would be pretty helpful for someone who can't really come up with that stuff on the fly for themselves.
I think equipment is just different in general throughout Cypher System. The way equipment is approached in general.
Yes.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, fantasy is one of those genres where you don't necessarily need it, but people love it.
Yes.
Yeah, and you need that tier. That's a great point, Al. I never even thought you need that tier magic item.
Yeah.
And I fall victim to Dean's thought processes. Like I just created them on the fly. I just made a list because once again we working on running. So and that was one of the first things I did. I took an artifact list and then I made a mid tier magic item list and a low tier magic item list.
Yeah.
But most people wouldn't think to do that. That's a great point, Al.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest problem for me when it comes to talking about these things because I just see what needs to be done and I can do it. Whereas we're talking about for people who are going to run into these issues. So yeah, it makes perfect sense. Good call, Al.
Yeah, I mean it's like in my game at home, like my rogue wanted to upgrade his his gauntlets or whatever, his like brass knuckles, but like I didn't really have anything to fall back within the book to say, hey, now it does a little more damage or whatever have you. Like I had him describe to me what he wanted to do with them, and I did it in a sort of a narrative way where he like met a they had access to a smithery, and one of the other characters is a blacksmith, and he had him do it for him. But again, I don't think there's really too much direction given in the book on how to handle that sort of situation.
But that's a good idea. I like that. I might have to steal that. Do it.
And one of the ways to handle that as well is you can always tack on a character ability onto the existing weapon to tier it up. So like say perfect example is he had gauntlets that did normal higher damage than what a traditional non-magic gauntlet would do. Now add the bash ability to those gauntlets after he went to the blacksmith or someone to tear it up or something like that.
Yeah, definitely ways to tackle it, but no super duper direction in the books.
Yep.
But yeah, that's definitely something.
So Dean, you wanna go negative or you still kumbaya? Everything's perfect. You don't have a busted chops.
I don't care.
But I think we hit traditional fantasy to death at this point. So let's, Dean. I think you can move on with the next section of fantasy we're tackling.
So the next section is going to be modern or contemporary fantasy, and the wiki definition of that is contemporary fantasy, also known as modern fantasy or indigenous fantasy, is a subgenre of fantasy set in the present day, or more accurately, the time period of the maker. It is perhaps most popular for a subgenre of urban fantasy. Examples of modern or contemporary fantasy would be Dresden Files, Harry Potter, The Magicians, Twilight series, American Gods, Bright, Big Trouble in Little China, Bert, The Librarians, Carnival Row, Once Upon a Time, Golden Compass, just to name some, that would be considered modern fantasy or contemporary. So, and there is a difference between modern and contemporary fantasy.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
Go ahead, Al. You
no,
can
I was gonna say, like, I learned like 5 minutes prior to starting the video what the difference is, because I asked these gentlemen because I thought they were synonyms, but no. So it was explained to me, and I'll explain it to you all at home. Modern fantasy would be fantasy set in our modern times, or maybe even a slightly future time, a little more in the future, but just about our modern times, with some fantasy elements in it, whether it be magic or whatever have you. But it has those fantasy elements, but the time setting is within our time frame. Whereas contemporary fantasy, while in the same like sort of vein of modern, it's more of a set piece of a period time. So you can, let's say, have a 1920s contemporary fantasy, or like an ancient Egyptian contemporary fantasy, and that's really the major difference there.
Yeah, pretty much well said. Sort of like what usually contemporary fantasy, even though not always the case, it's when the person wrote it. Like if
Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, Call of Cthulhu is perfect. That's the great example. You know what I mean? Like it's wrote it at the time period the person wrote it, and since we're reading it 80 years later, it's still contemporary. It's not a fictional world. It's still our world, just in that time period.
Right.
That makes sense.
I think that this is probably the one area that this is the sandbox I like to play in the most with Cypher System. I think if you've seen a lot of my games, is I like fantasy elements in contemporary and modern times, and this is also the fantasy genre that allows you to bring in other genres very easily. Like you can easily bring in horror, you can easily bring in romance, you can easily bring in, this is the melting pot of fantasy genres. Modern fantasy could incorporate many subgenres at the same time. So this is probably my favorite of the fantasy genres.
I mean, there's definitely a ton to do within the scope of modern fantasy, and it's again there's so many different books to look at as far as Monte Cook Games goes that you could draw inspiration for these worlds and settings. What you call it? I'm blanking on some books now, but I'm sure you guys.
I can answer this one for you in a very easy. Pretty much everything Monte Cook Games made could be drawn into modern fantasy in one way or another.
Yep. Yeah, that is actually a very succinct way to put it.
I mean, of course, we put the disclaimer out there that it doesn't mean that you can take it straight out the book without some reflavoring or reconstructing. But pretty much any book, there's going to be stuff you could pull out of Numenera. There's going to be stuff you could pull out of The Strange. There's going to be stuff you could pull out of Predation.
Well, there's like prime example. There was, we named some stuff, but there was one we didn't name, and probably is kind of obscure to a lot of people anyway. But I'm old and I watched lots of movies. But James Cameron, not James Cameron, I can't think of his name. What was the guy who did all the Roger Corman?
Yeah.
Roger Corman did a movie called Death Race, and it was basically 20, 30 years in the future for him. So it's set like in like,
wasn't it called Death Race 2000?
No. There was
Death Race 1999.
No, there was Death Race 2000. There was Death Race 2000. That's where they were, driving the cars and all that kind of stuff. But it was just crazy because he had tropes, weird little fantasy tropes built into it.
That's with the guy
David
from
Carradine.
Kung Fu. Yeah, the guy from Kung Fu.
David Carradine, yeah. Well, David Carradine did a few Roger Corman movies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The original was called Death Race. The sequel was called Death Race 2000.
Right.
David Carradine played Frankenstein.
Yep.
Oh boy.
And then there were like there's just like other things that have been done. I can't remember the title of the movie. I got to think of it. But he did one where it was kind of post-apocalyptic. It was maybe 50 years after a nuclear holocaust, and the guys are running around. They called them range guys. They were like futuristic rangers. It was really cool stuff. But all that kind of stuff could be done easily in Cypher without a lot of problem.
Yeah, like Anthony was saying before, you can look and basically you can pick up any Monte Cook Games book and find some sort of inspiration or something to use with little to no reflavoring, due to the nature of the modern fantasy. Because especially if you're looking at our what you call it, our modern times, there's so many different things that can be incorporated, whether it be technology, magic, because it's a fantasy setting. Like so many things just fit within this setting or this genre.
I also think too that this genre as well incorporates a lot of more traditional folklore. Like you could tap into Japanese fantasy elements. You could tap into Chinese, like with Big Trouble in Little China. You could tap into African folklore. I think traditional fantasy, most of the tropes are seated in European mythology and European history. In modern fantasy, it opens it up to everyone and everything. Like so there's a lot more ways you could take your narrative into cool and interesting ways that isn't necessarily traditional fantasy, but it's definitely fantasy. You know,
It makes a lot of sense. And again, because there's a fantasy element, and you mentioned what you call it, incorporating into these settings, like there's so many different ways to flavor like high magical beings, like within, like I think I don't know much about American gods, but that they have like human embodiments of these gods, right? And it'd be so easy to have deities in your world who are just like regular PC, not PCs, but like NPCs or whatever have you. And I don't know, it just gives you so much to play with as far as your narrative goes. They could be actual literal gods, or they could be these street level people that you just interact with on a daily basis. Like, there are just so many fun and different ways you could take it.
Or another major element of modern fantasy is not necessarily magic or gods, but different races put into our modern time period. So like shadow, you have elves and dwarves and orcs living with humans, in the
like
modern,
the movie Bright that we
yeah,
mentioned.
in the modern society. That's also considered traditional fantasy. And it could be low magic or high magic, but set in a modern time.
Yep.
Yeah,
which is interesting. Yeah.
Well, one movie that comes to mind, and I actually can comment on this, even though there's no humans in it. Onward, that Pixar movie, it's like a modern world where they forgot about their magical ancestry, but there's still elements of the fantasy, and it sparks in this kid of the main character. If you haven't seen that movie, go watch it. It's freaking amazing. But that is an example of that modern fantasy. Like everything's they have technology, they have cell phones and cars and all that, but they are still magical creatures. They're like, what is it, centaurs and trolls and pixies, but there's no magic in the world at that time. But that's a whole plot element. But either way,
you could also go the Harry Potter route where it's modern time, but he gets transported into a magical place,
the surrealistic world,
and then comes back to modern time. That's also considered modern fantasy, because it has the element contemporary fantasy, because it's probably like the 1950s, right, or something like that. But either way, it has fantasy elements. Then he goes back to, and those two worlds kind of intertwine every once in a while, but not all the time. And my favorite out of this whole list is the Dresden Files. That is the epitome of modern fantasy, urban fantasy. You have the urban mage casting spells, living in modern times. That's an absolutely phenomenal series. And if anyone has read any of those books, I highly recommend you read the Dresden Files.
And you guys bring up some great stuff. Dresden Files, but one little ditty that a lot of people don't realize is probably one of my favorites is Big Trouble in Little China. you know, we listed it on the list, but a lot of people probably wouldn't see that as, you know, contemporary or urban fantasy, but it absolutely is. You know, you've got a guy wanting to bring down, you know, the demon god, you know, get his immortality. You know, you got the elements, the three storms, just
It
so
has,
many.
and it's all based on magic,
Right,
which,
all based
and there's
on,
multiple races in that. You know, there's
yes,
non-human races. It's absolutely contemporary fantasy.
one of my favorite movies of all times. So,
All right, so
so
what are some of the let's give some people some advice, like what are some of the tips and tricks you could do? Like how do you incorporate ciphers and artifacts in modern fantasy?
well, ciphers and artifacts in modern fantasy to me are that those cool little things that, you know, the everyday world uses for one thing, but if you know the secret, you know, you can, it can actually become, you know, something else. You know, like for example, you know, using Big Trouble in Little China, you know, the nine demon bottle. You know, you had to, you know, brew the tea and drink the tea, and when you drink the tea, you know, you, it allows you to see things and do things that you could normally do, but it only lasts a certain amount of time. You know, so stuff like that.
But there's just a bunch of different ways to incorporate like ciphers and artifacts specifically into these settings. Because like we said before, because of the nature of the genre, where you have modern tech and also fantasy elements with magic or whatever have you, supernatural stuff, you can have ciphers in the form of gadgets and tech. Like they could be like what is it like things with low battery that you use it once they stop working, or things that are fragile they use it once they break, and what you call it it'd be super easy to flavor those things because again you have multiple like sources of like what you call it special effects, quote unquote, in that world, because it could come from tech, it could be just good technology, or it could be a magical thing. There's
Right.
so many different things to play with, and it's like Anthony said, it's that melting pot. It's that you can basically throw anything into this genre and it works.
Well, it's like I said,
Uh,
you think about what you're saying now. I mean, perfect example. You know what you were saying. You know, people get something. You find a flashbang grenade. You know, you find this or you find that. So yeah,
I mean, I was going to say that this is um this is probably the most interesting one for artifacts and ciphers because you could incorporate the technology of that era. So you have cell phones if you're doing modern. You have cell phones. You have vape pens. You have earbuds. You have there's all sorts. You have laptops. So there's so many different ways you can incorporate unique abilities into artifacts and ciphers. A vape pen. I saw you lift up that's the perfect. You who says you need a healing potion? You can have a healing vape pen. You can have a vape pen that makes you grow. Or you could go the vert route. The feathers. There's so many different ways you could attack ciphers and artifacts in a modern setting to make it unique and special to just your setting. Like if you want to make a chocolate chip cookie be every cipher be a different variation of a chocolate chip cookie, you can. You know, so it's a lot easier to incorporate ciphers and artifacts. Um,
and in the same breath, Anthony, you know, it is so much easier. But you can also go the subtle cipher route. The subtle cipher route will also work wonderfully in a modern setting. You know, it really
Absolutely.
depends on what flavor you're trying to build for your game.
Yep. Absolutely. And artifacts, you basically can use any artifact from a traditional fantasy setting because everybody read those books and seen those movies where they found Excalibur's sword that was 100,000 years old, and a modern character's wielding Excalibur's sword. Or you could have that magical M16 rifle, or you know what I mean? Like you can take it into so many different crazy directions. I get excited just talking about, the ways you can use artifacts in a
Well,
modern fantasy
think about
setting.
it. Look at Thor Ragnarok, and they gave the Executioner two M16s. You know, you know.
And just to go back a little bit and touch on subtle ciphers, they can, again, most of the time subtle ciphers are supposed to be, again, what they're described as subtle. They just do something kind of minor. But in a modern fantasy setting, or even in a high fantasy setting, whatever, they can be, subtle ciphers can be a little bit more extreme. They can be like touches from a god or whatever have you, depending on what your setting is. A touch of a wild surge of magic, like what Dean was saying. Like, subtle ciphers can be extreme in these settings. They don't have to necessarily come from a manifest cipher, these extreme effects.
Right. Good point.
Just something to throw out there.
So, what do you think is well, and what needs adjustments in modern fantasy?
I think this is kind of. I think this is Cypher System's wheelhouse. So there isn't much adjustments that need to be made. I think that Cypher's way of doing magic. This is the reason why Cypher System does magic for this particular reason. I think that the magic system, this is how it works in modern settings, and I think that that when they made the Cypher Core book, it was to encapsulate this feel of the way magic works. So, and what it does well is, I think, like I pretty much said, like with any universal system, really, not just Cypher System, but with any universal role-playing system, traditional modern settings is usually what they excel in. And they usually have difficulties when they branch off into specific types of gameplay, but they all usually do modern well. And I think Cypher's no different.
That's gonna be a hard agree. Like I've been saying throughout this whole little discussion about this specific genre, like there's like so many things from all the books you can throw into this genre. Like they all fit, even with little to no reflavoring. And again, it's like Anthony said, it really, like, if you're playing a magical character in a modern game or modern fantasy game or world, Cypher really captures that feel of how it usually works in those stories. Usually you might have one or two spells that you're like, you pass down your bloodline or whatever have you, and you focus on those one or two spells, and that's about it. Or, whatever, as the story progresses, you might learn a couple more, but it's always within that specific, like, frame of, like, whatever school of magic or whatever have you. So it does capture it super duper well. And as far as adjustments, like, it's hard to say because it does it so well. Like, the only thing I would say is, like, the other thing, if someone's trying to capture that Vancian type magic within the setting, that's where you get that same fallback as from the high fantasy.
Yeah.
And that's about it.
I'll say it this way. And Harry Potter is like the best example of it. Harry Potter was a game. I mean, It was a book, set of books and movies and stuff. When you think about it, they hearken to the whole idea of the Vancian spell system. There was tons of books, tons of spells, but the kids didn't learn them all, and they specialized. And so I think probably, if I would say there was a negative to how it handles this genre, is the fact that its flexibility can become overwhelming if you don't kind of focus in and build the magic system the way you want it to run.
It's funny, not to bust, but Dean's negative is like saying, my daughter's too beautiful.
Well, she is.
You got anything negative to say about that girl? Oh yeah, she's just too damn hot.
Oh man. But yeah, no.
Again, that's just the way the brain works, guys.
It just handles this genre just so swimmingly. It's hard to say like what adjustments could be made to it. Quite honestly,
I think this is what Cypher Core is meant to do on a daily basis. Not just fantasy, but modern contemporary stories. It's just its wheelhouse, And like I said before, I think most universal systems usually do modern and contemporary well.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess we could go into the last of our final three fantasy genres, and that would be science fantasy. And once again, we took this from the same Wikipedia, and the Wikipedia was called Fantasy Genres, period. So we were lucky enough to get all three from the same one wiki. So this one, the definition is as follows. Science fantasy is a mixed genre within the umbrella of speculative fiction, which simultaneously draws upon or combines tropes and elements of both science fiction and fantasy. Where science fiction does not permit the existence of fantasy or supernatural elements, science fantasy explicitly relies upon them. And some of the examples of science fantasy, the most obvious is Star Wars, Flash Gordon, Shadowrun, Dune, Fifth Element, John Carter from Mars, Crow, Heavy Metal, and Avatar. I think a lot of these are pretty familiar to most people, and I think this is another genre that is probably the most popular in Hollywood. Like
Right
I think
now.
this is like major media. They tend to really like to fuse science and fantasy together. So could you guys tell me the difference between science fantasy and traditional fantasy?
D?
Go ahead, Al. You can fill this one.
He answered the last one.
Yeah, I'm
You did?
not, and I'm
Yeah.
not super good at
Well, science fantasy, basically where you take um, science, scientific ideas, and you intertwine them with magic and fanciful ideas, concepts. You know, like you said, the most famous one is Star Wars. So you've got spaceships; they're flying at the faster than speed of light. You've got blasters that shoot, concentrated energy blasts and stuff like that. Classic science fiction ideas. Whereas you turn around and then you add in these mystical warriors that, tap into a power source that isn't explained. It's just, and they're doing fanciful things with it, So, it's that type of thing. It's the marrying of, these concepts and coming up with a good story for them.
I think another way to explain it is that traditional fantasy wouldn't have spaceships, wouldn't have alien races. They will have races that
Are
share the
indigenous to a
same,
planet.
yeah, share the same planet, but they wouldn't have other planets. They wouldn't have spaceships. They wouldn't have high tech. They wouldn't have lasers. So when science fantasy would have traditional fantasy with all those elements added to it.
yep, yep.
Spelljammers.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about that, in that science fantasy genre, is again, I'm not a super I'm not a super fan of I don't watch Star Wars or whatever. But one cool thing about when you're running a science fantasy game in Cypher System is that even if a person doesn't have the fantasy elements to draw back for their powers or whatever have you, they have the science aspect. So they might not be a force user or whatever in the Star Wars world, but they might be like a bounty hunter where they're very good with a weapon or whatever have you. So it still gives players or even the GM different aspects, a lot of different aspects to work with as far as their setting and genre or whatever goes.
Yeah, and narratively, that's a good point. That narratively, you have a lot of it'll be a science fiction story, but a lot of the traditional fantasy tropes, like the knightly character, like to use Star Wars as an example, the Jedi is a paladin. You know what I mean? Or like Dean affectionately, Paladin. Like I for some reason now I just been saying Paladin. It's like I'm gonna make that the thing now. But you have those knightly, like the valor, there's a lot of
Honor.
yeah, and there's a lot of save the princess in sci-fi fantasies, like
Well, that's what it
narratives.
is. It's sci-fi, or should we say sci-fantasy?
Mm,
That's literally what happens. They take the traditional fantasy tropes,
mm,
save the princess,
mm,
find the magic item,
mm,
the artifact, you know, uh, the rebellion, rise up against the tyranny. All of those actions.
Learn from the master, like
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then, when you start looking at those things, we talking about Star Wars, but I mean, I guess that could kind of lead us right into the next question. What books and MCG would we, use for that? And of course, you got to take the mother lode with Numenera. You know, Numenera is the mother lode because this is a game that what I loved about it when I first read it. I read the book and I'm going, oh, wizard, oh, thief, oh, war, but they're glaives, nanos, and jacks. And the thing about it is, those traditional concepts of those characters were there. It was written, that all day long I saw a rogue every time I looked at the jack, and I wanted to play one because it was cool.
Yeah, Numenera is science fantasy though.
Yeah.
I didn't put it on the list because I thought it was kind of a given, but traditionally that's what Numenera is. It's science fantasy. So you could pretty much use everything from Numenera. Specifically, what's if you were designing a science fantasy world, right? Well, we were talking about it off camera earlier today. The artifact and what's the name of that book? D, you mentioned it. The one with that has all the artifacts and oddities in it.
Encyclopedia of Impossible Things.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, we could definitely pull that.
But on top of that though, even though this book is a hard sci-fi book, not sci-fi, I guess it is hard sci-fi, hard science fiction. What is it? The Stars Are Fire would be a great book to have for running these sort of games for that science aspect of a game. Not too much the fantasy aspect, but there's a lot of good stuff in there for that science aspect. Specifically, a lot of their their ship rules, like their manned vehicle rules, like those would be fantastic to have on deck for running a science fiction game, or excuse me, a science fantasy game.
Oh, also too came up on the server today about Stars of Fire. That I remember reading it, but I totally forgot that rule is in there. But in the Stars of Fire, it explains how, sort of like, I'm gonna use a Palladium term, but it has the mega damage rule, where if someone is using a knife on something like a tank, what's the process you do?
Yes.
And that actually comes up in fantasy science fiction all the time because you have that. I got a regular old broadsword and I'm trying to hit the side of a spaceship. Am I going to do any real damage to it?
And there's also the now that you mention it, the specific example mentioned in the book in Stars of Fire is what if there's units on the ground laying fire to a spaceship, which happens all the time in science fantasy. Yeah. Like you have these again the rebels trying to shoot down whatever and there's rules for that in place, which with just the core book it might be kind of hard to I'm drawing blank on the word here. Referee that, but with Stars of Fire, it's plainly stated how you should treat these level differences, whether it be tech level differences or a difference in whether a manned vehicle is being attacked by something in another manned vehicle or just another person or whatever. It takes all these little things into account, and it's actually really good at taking those things into account.
And with that being said, Al, that's also a way that if you wanted to, you could actually, if you wanted to make it gritty and scary, you know what? You guys are facing an ancient worm, an old dragon. This is an ancient red dragon. You're just people. You could apply those same kind of thought processes to that thing. How are we going to hurt this dragon? Oh, we got our swords. Tink, 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 tink. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, that would definitely fall under traditional fantasy, but absolutely, it's a rule set that you can utilize in more than one aspect of gaming.
I mean, even what Dean just said could be something used in science fantasy because they might come across some giant alien being and they're only small people, and
Yeah.
this scaling rules and Stars
Yeah,
of Fires
yeah,
could definitely
Well,
help
that's what
with
I'm
that.
saying. When I just said dragon because hey, there's space dragons.
I want to bring up another book I think that'll work really well in this, and actually worked. I could have brought it up in the category before, but Vert by Raven Desk Games is another book that you should be able to pull a lot of stuff for science fantasy because Vert has a lot of vehicles, it has laser pistols, it has all sorts of things that um might not, it'll have a different variation from Numenera, so it'll give you more options, and it also has a higher damage scale on their weapons and vehicles, which is also something that you could utilize in a science fantasy setting. So I would definitely check out Vert, which is more modern fantasy, but it would definitely help you with science fantasy. So I would definitely check it out for either one of those two genres.
And yeah, like just like in the other ones, the other settings that we discussed, um, let's talk about how to incorporate what you call it, ciphers and artifacts in the science fantasy genre. But it kind of goes back to what we were saying in the modern fantasy section, where so many different things work
Yeah.
within the scope of this setting. So like you can basically draw from any book and reskin it to be either the tech side of your setting or even the magic side of, like one thing could be either or in a science fantasy section or setting.
Or specifically, you could probably just take it straight from Numenera,
There we
and,
go.
because Numenera actually covers both those bases. So anything from Numenera is probably going to work with little to no reskinning or
And
reflavoring.
speaking of that, then another book that would probably be very handy would be Worlds Numberless. You know, for the science fantasy because you can literally build whatever trope you wanted. Especially for um, you
Oh,
know,
worlds numberless and strange, right?
yeah, from the
For
strange Worlds
just in
Numberless.
case somebody doesn't know the actual name of the book.
I apologize,
Yeah,
but yeah, Worlds Numberless from Strange. That book would be a bevy of material, especially if you need the seeds to build the world itself that you're trying to do. Conceptually, it's one of the best books out there.
yeah, that's top three of my favorite all time. I love worlds. I just sometimes I just read worlds numberless and strange like a fiction book.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, honestly, you're right because for me, it does. It really inspires, you know, what I want to do.
Yeah, it's just a fun book to read.
Yeah.
But
Now that you said that, I'm gonna have to read it again.
yeah, so I don't think there's really too much more to say about like ciphers and artifacts. Like it's so
Yeah,
easy to handle those within a science fantasy setting because again, if you want to just touch a little bit more on artifacts, they could be magical items or items again from the fantasy sort of genre or sort of setting. But there's also you have technology to use as your because in science fantasy, most of the time this tech is super advanced, as such you see in Numenera. So it's even more easy to create artifacts for this setting as opposed to even a modern one because in modern
yeah,
you're restricted to what's happening in real life or maybe
yeah,
slightly in the future, whereas in this one the sky's the limit. Like tech could do whatever the hell you want it to do.
yeah.
Like so it's super easy to do those things. But on the flip side, what do you feel like Cypher System would need adjustments for to run this setting well? My thing was before Stars of Fire came out, I find myself like, how are they going to pilot this vehicle and attack something else and blah blah blah. Like the Stars of Fire coming out with their rule set for the vehicle interactions helped me a ton when thinking
Yeah.
about this this setting, and that would have been my complaint. But again, the Stars of Fire kind of remedied that.
Probably, you know what? I think overall, you guys have said it 1,000 times. If we're going to talk about anything being a negative, Cypher has areas of vagueness that if you are not necessarily the type of person to, dig into your own wheelhouse and start building, it might fall short. So, because what you just said, Stars of Fire filled a void for you because you struggled with that idea, you know. And I could say the same thing, that, depending on what I was doing, like when I tried to build the Power Ranger game, I had to come up with how mechs worked, you know, which was definitely a science fantasy game the way I ran it. So, it's interesting that now that I can look at Stars of Fire and get some rules for mechs, and, now it's official, it's applicable from the game standpoint, from the rules it's written.
Yeah, that honestly was my biggest hurdle. Anthony knows that one of my first forays into Cypher System was trying. When we worked on it together, was developing a little Power Rangers type game or setting. But and as anyone who's played in the game will tell you that the mech rules felt the clunkiest. They kind of felt a little out of place. But looking back at looking at the Stars of Fire and then looking back at what I did, I definitely have a much clearer idea if I were to do Power Rangers again, how I would handle the mech and the Megazord and all that because of the Stars of Fire, which was
Same,
it was
yeah, same
awesome
here.
seeing that.
You know,
Yeah. But yeah.
I think that Numenera is basically science fantasy at its finest. I think it's probably one of the best like iterations of a science fantasy genre I've ever seen. It's made me love the Cypher System in the first place, like the beauty of the setting of Numenera. So I don't necessarily think it does anything really that like it needs much improvement on, because I think Numenera, especially with Discovery and Destiny, I think Numenera kind of has this like niche and lane pretty much down packed. This is like their wheelhouse. This is so I think the only thing I would like, and I think this is kind of for Cypher System in general. I think I want a little more variety in the bestiaries and a little more different types of options instead of hungers for flesh as a common type of
monster
creature type.
motivation.
Yeah, monster. And I even though Numenera has 3 bestiaries, um, I think if you didn't have all 3, you wouldn't have you know, the variety that you're looking for. And once again, some people like me personally, I have no problems reskinning stuff, but I could see when someone that needs it statted out for them, how that could be an issue if you're developing your own original fantasy science fiction setting, not necessarily playing in the Numenera, sandbox. So
It's
I would think the variety in the bestiaries would be the one area I think for this specific genre. I think could be worked on.
and so if you take a step further with that too, the vestries are good, but also just equipment in general. You know, I would say might be a big hurdle to overcome. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there, but they're artifacts or they're uh, ciphers. What about just mundane things? What about vehicles? What about day to day life things? You know, because I guess when I look at Numenera, I love it because to me it's this massive sandbox with lots of information, but none of it is like etched in stone.
Yeah,
So
it's like part of the reason why we love it because of the vagueness and the not a need to stat anything out is
yeah,
one of the reasons that it becomes a barrier for players that come from different systems because is getting over that hurdle of everything doesn't be like what's a positive for us is a hindrance for others.
exactly. I mean, when you think about Numenera and you're talking about it, think about the number of books that there are for Numenera. But every one of those books is kind of a niche. It's not like J Colossus. J Colossus, awesome book. Lots of tools in it, but it's just one place, and
Yeah,
that
and
place,
but it has mechanics like the dungeon generator and all that
right? That's
that's
what I'm saying.
unique.
Tool, yeah.
Yeah,
You
unique
know,
and special.
if you look at the Into series, the Into the Night, Into the Outside, Into the Deep. Those books, again, kind of focused, but broad. And for me, those are the things that, like you said, it's exciting and it's inspiring. So the biggest thing I would try to tell people about doing fantasy in Cypher System is kind of understand Cypher System itself, and then shift that mindset a little bit and dive in and build your world. Don't My biggest thing, I say it all the time, don't try to convert, adapt.
Yep.
Get that feeling, get that flavor, and I think the sky's the limit then.
Yeah, I definitely echo that sentiment as far as my final thing goes. As far as running, or excuse me, the fantasy genre as a whole within Cypher System, is try to make it your own. I mean, it's more than okay to try to like emulate or convert a setting or whatever have you, but what I'm doing with my home high fantasy traditional fantasy game, I'm having a lot more fun collaborating with my table over like the locations and like whatever have you, and like where magic comes from and like all the stuff that makes the fantasy setting. Like I'm collaborating with my table. I'm not trying too hard to like define the world for them. I'm losing my train of thought here, but essentially just dive in, do your thing, and don't get bogged down with trying to follow tropes to a T. If that makes sense.
Yep.
I think my final thought would be the further you get away from science, the more physical work you have to do when you're developing your setting. I think that like if you start off at traditional fantasy, you're gonna have a lot more reskinning to do. You're gonna have a lot more looking at multiple books to make your setting fit and work. But the closer you get to actual science in your fantasy game, the least amount of reskinning, the least amount of monsters you have to restat, the least amount of actual changes you have to make to what's written in the book. You could take a lot more stuff directly from the book into your game. So if you're sort of the person that don't want to run some sort of fantasy, but don't want to have to reskin and do a lot of additional GM labor, then you should consider more modern or science fiction fantasy with the Cypher book. But if you're the person that doesn't mind doing the extra legwork, then go ahead and tackle fantasy, traditional fantasy, because that's what I'm doing now, and I'm having a blast and I'm loving it. So
You're
it's
not doing it alone.
yeah. I mean, I'm doing my game alone, but so I'm having a blast and I'm loving it. So I definitely seen that now, and there's no right or wrong way, and there's nothing bad tackling either method. But I do think that it's more work the further away you are from traditional science for a GM. That's my final thought.
Makes sense. Yeah, so this has been a fantastic discussion, guys. Thank you all out there for watching it. Anthony, I believe you have a couple things you want to tell everybody.
Yeah, sure. Al said, I think that first off, if you enjoy our videos and you like what we do, what you call it, and in the kindness of your heart, you want to help us out and support us in any way, even though you do not have to. We never ask for financial support for anyone that watches or joins our server. But if you find it in the kindness of your heart, we do have a Ko-fi set up. You could stop by our coffee and give us a little donation, or visit our online store and purchase some of this cool Cypher Unlimited gear. And, and if you can't do any of those things, that's fine as well. But please just give us a like, share, subscribe to our YouTube channel. The more people that like, share, and subscribe our channel, the more the YouTube algorithm shows it to other people, and the more exposure we get. So we really appreciate it either one way or another. Or join our Discord server, which is a great place to chat, play games, talk about games, and talk to us personally because we're on there every day, or talk to 3,000 other Cypher System lovers and Cypher System enthusiasts. So please join us. Thanks.
Oh, you forgot one thing, Anthony. We
What?
also have a Facebook page, Cypher Unlimited, under the same name.
Yeah.
So come by and see us on Facebook as well if you don't do Discord. We try to put up information. Anybody ask questions out there, we're ready to discuss it. We can talk about Cypher all day, all night, as you guys know.
But all the links to the stuff mentioned will be down below in the description. So be sure to check that out. Hit those links. Show your support. We really appreciate everything. And thank you so much for watching. And from us at the CU, we will see you later.